Let me ask you something. What if I told you that a former professional wrestler, someone who entertained crowds with her strength and skill, turned into one of the most infamous serial killers in Mexican history? Between the late 90s and 2006, Juana Barraza, known as La Mataviejitas or the Old Lady Killer, terrorized the streets of Mexico City, preying on some of the most vulnerable members of society, elderly women. Her story is not only shocking but filled with tragedy, rage, and betrayal, woven deeply into her own painful past. This isn't fiction. This is the real and haunting story of Juana Barraza, a woman whose wrestling career would take a horrifying turn into the darkest depths of crime. How did she go from a lucha libre wrestler loved for her strength to a feared serial killer, leaving more than 40 victims in her wake? Today, we're diving deep into this chilling case. But before we go any further, I want to thank you all for your incredible support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions keep me going, and together we uncover the truth behind some of the world's most disturbing and mind boggling crimes. So let's unravel the mystery of Juana Barraza, and trust me, you're going to want to hear every detail. Juana Barraza's early life reads like the tragic backstory of someone who was failed by every figure of authority meant to protect her. Born in 1957 in Hidalgo, Mexico, Barraza's childhood was not just one of poverty but of intense abuse and abandonment. Her mother, Justice Samperio, was an alcoholic whose neglect set the stage for one of the most heartbreaking betrayals a child could face. When Barraza was only 12 years old, her mother did the unthinkable. She traded her daughter to an older man in exchange for just a few beers. This wasn't a symbolic exchange. This man took control of Barraza's life, subjecting her to years of sexual and emotional abuse. She became a prisoner, sold by the very person who was supposed to shield her from harm. Barraza remained in this hellish situation for years, and by the time she managed to escape, the damage was already done. The abuse Barraza endured not only scarred her physically but also shaped her psychologically. Her relationship with her mother was beyond fractured, it was destroyed, leaving her with a profound hatred for older women whom she subconsciously associated with the betrayal she felt from her mother. This animosity would later be a driving force behind the murders she committed. Each of her victims, elderly women, became stand ins for the mother who had cast her aside. Barraza's childhood was one of survival, not nurturing. And while many people experience traumatic childhoods, for Juana Barraza, the line between victim and predator blurred as her bottled up rage against her mother transformed into something much darker. It was in this space of unresolved pain and fury that the seeds of her future crimes were planted. Juana Barraza's transformation from a lucha libre wrestler into a serial killer is one of the most haunting turns in criminal history. Before she became known as La Mataviejitas, Barraza was better known in the wrestling world as La Dama del Silencio, or the Lady of Silence. The name she chose for herself seemed fitting. Silence was something she was accustomed to, from the years of abuse in her childhood to the years spent suppressing her growing rage. In the world of Mexican wrestling, lucha libre, Barraza found an outlet for her physical strength and pent-up aggression. Wearing a pink mask and flashy costumes, she performed in small wrestling circuits, embracing the role of an underdog, a fighter who could take on anyone in the ring. Wrestling gave her an identity beyond the trauma she carried. As La Dama del Silencio, she was powerful, feared, and respected everything she had never been growing up. Yet, despite the thrill of the matches and the escapism wrestling provided, her career was far from glamorous. Unlike the larger than life personas seen in professional wrestling, Barraza's earnings were meager. She wrestled not in grand arenas, but in small, often rundown venues where the pay barely covered living expenses. When an injury forced her to step away from wrestling, her financial situation worsened. She had been living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to support herself and her children. With her wrestling career effectively over, Barraza was left without the one thing that had allowed her to feel in control. The injury marked the beginning of her descent into a life of crime. Desperate for money, Barraza turned to theft. At first, she committed burglaries to get by, but over time, her crimes escalated into something far darker. The emotional scars from her childhood, her deep seated resentment towards her mother merged with the financial strain, and it was then that she began targeting elderly women. For Barraza, these women represented the mother who had betrayed her, and each murder became an act of symbolic revenge. Her wrestling experience played a critical role in the way she carried out her murders. Barraza used her strength and the wrestling holds she had perfected in the ring to overpower her victims. Often posing as a government worker offering assistance to the elderly, she would gain their trust, enter their homes, and then strangle them using whatever she could find: scarves, cables, or other household items. Each killing was quick, brutal, and silent, much like her wrestling persona. This transition from a struggling wrestler to one of Mexico's most feared serial killers was shaped by a combination of physical power, psychological trauma, and financial desperation. As La Dama del Silencio, Barraza controlled the wrestling ring. As La Mataviejitas, she controlled the lives and deaths of her vulnerable victims. Juana Barraza's first known murder occurred sometime in the late 1990s, though the exact date remains unclear due to the complexity of the investigation and her reluctance to confess to all of her crimes. What is known is that this first murder marked the beginning of a terrifying spree that would eventually claim the lives of numerous elderly women across Mexico City. To gain access to her victims, Barraza adopted a chilling yet effective strategy. She would disguise herself as a government worker or a nurse, often claiming to be part of a welfare program designed to help elderly people. This guise allowed her to approach vulnerable older women without arousing suspicion. Most of her victims were over 60 years old, lived alone, and were often isolated from family members, perfect targets for Barraza's manipulative tactics. Her first victim followed this exact pattern. After gaining her trust and entering the woman's home, Barraza would quickly and brutally overpower her. Leveraging the strength and wrestling techniques she had honed as La Dama del Silencio, Barraza would subdue her victims, often using objects found in the home like scarves or telephone cords to strangle them. She would leave the crime scene quickly, making it difficult for investigators to connect the murders at first. The police were slow to recognize a pattern, partly because elderly women often passed away from natural causes, and the possibility of a serial killer targeting this specific demographic seemed improbable. In the early years, many of Barraza's murders were written off as accidents or robberies gone wrong, but the brutality of her methods and the growing number of victims soon revealed a far more sinister truth. As this first murder went undetected, Barraza became bolder. The shock of what she had done did not lead her to stop. Instead, it fueled her twisted drive for more. Each time, she refined her methods, becoming more calculated and more ruthless. With each killing, her ability to manipulate and deceive her victims became more honed, making her one of Mexico's most notorious serial killers. This first murder would later be recognized as the starting point of a years long killing spree that terrorized Mexico City. It was the beginning of her transformation from an ex wrestler struggling with financial hardship into the notorious old lady killer feared by an entire city. As Juana Barraza's killing spree continued, a clear pattern began to emerge, both in her methods and in her choice of victims. Barraza's modus operandi was deeply rooted in her ability to deceive and overpower elderly women, many of whom lived alone. These women were often easy targets because they were isolated, vulnerable, and trusted someone who appeared to be offering help. Barraza typically posed as a social worker or nurse, sometimes even carrying fake credentials. She would knock on her victims' doors under the pretense of offering assistance, such as signing them up for government benefits or conducting routine health checkups. Her victims, elderly women who were often lonely and in need of help, welcomed her into their homes without a second thought. Once inside, Barraza's true intentions would quickly become apparent. She would waste no time overpowering her victims, often relying on her wrestling background to subdue them physically. Using her immense strength and knowledge of wrestling techniques, she would apply a chokehold, rendering her victims defenseless. The brutality didn't end there. Barraza would often strangle them with items she found in their own homes, such as scarves, stockings, or telephone cords. The use of personal belongings to commit the murders added a grotesque intimacy to the crimes, as these items were part of the women's daily lives. A particularly disturbing detail of her mo was the way she tied the knots. Barraza often used a method resembling wrestling holds to secure the ligatures around her victims' necks. This precision led investigators to initially suspect that the killer was a man with some form of professional wrestling experience. It wasn't until much later, after multiple witness descriptions of a strong, broad woman fleeing crime scenes, that the police shifted their focus toward Barraza. Barraza's victims were all elderly women, typically over the age of 60, and most lived alone in urban areas like Mexico City. Many of them had little to no regular contact with family members, which made it easier for Barraza to operate undetected for several years. The women were not only vulnerable due to their age and isolation, but they were also unsuspecting of Barraza's intentions, which allowed her to strike with little resistance. The pattern was both chilling and efficient, gaining trust through deception, using strength to overpower, and employing objects from the victim's own home to finish the crime. This combination of psychological manipulation and physical force made her one of the most feared killers in Mexican history. With each victim, her techniques remained eerily consistent, making it clear that this was not an impulsive act, but a well practiced, deliberate method of murder. This consistency is part of what ultimately helped law enforcement connect the dots and realize they were dealing with a serial killer who had a very specific profile and target in mind. As Juana Barraza's killing spree continued through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, Mexico City found itself in the grip of fear. By now, the bodies of elderly women were being discovered with disturbing regularity, all showing signs of similar violence. The public, noticing a horrifying pattern, began to speculate about the presence of a serial killer. However, for a long time, the authorities resisted this idea, fearing it might spark widespread panic. They initially treated each murder as an isolated incident, despite the obvious connections between the victims. The media, however, wasn't so restrained. As more elderly women were found murdered in their homes, newspapers latched onto the story, recognizing that something more sinister was at play. Sensational headlines began to surface, warning the public of a killer preying on the most vulnerable members of society. It was the press that first gave Barraza the nickname La Mataviejitas, the old lady killer, a name that would soon become infamous across Mexico. This media attention grew rapidly as the death toll climbed. Each new victim fueled front page stories, with reporters delving into the terrifying details of how these elderly women were being targeted and strangled in their own homes. The more the press covered the story, the more frightened the public became. Fear rippled through Mexico City, particularly among older women living alone who suddenly realized they fit the profile of the killer's victims. Many elderly residents began to change their daily routines, refusing to answer the door for strangers and even questioning their trust in neighbors and caregivers. The police, under growing pressure from both the public and the media, were forced to admit that a serial killer was at large, but their early investigations were clouded by confusion. Due to the strength required to subdue and strangle the victims, investigators initially believed the killer to be male. In fact, the police wasted valuable time focusing on male suspects, including transgender women, based on witness reports of a figure with broad shoulders and large hands fleeing the scenes of the crimes. While the police stumbled, the media continued to stoke public anxiety. Each new murder brought fresh headlines, and the city was soon gripped by full blown paranoia. Elderly women, already marginalized and vulnerable, were now living in fear of being the next victim of La Mataviejitas. Some even took to the streets to protest, demanding that the government do more to protect them and bring the killer to justice. The media's relentless coverage not only spread fear, but also made Barraza a larger than life figure, casting her as an almost mythical villain. This attention fed into Barraza's actions as she continued her deadly spree without slowing down, seemingly undeterred by the growing spotlight. It wasn't until years later, when police finally pieced together the evidence, that Barraza's reign of terror would come to an end. But by that time, her name was already burned into Mexico City's history as the old lady killer, and her crimes had permanently scarred the city's elderly population. As the bodies of elderly women continued to pile up in Mexico City, the police found themselves in a race against time to catch the killer. However, the investigation was marred by a series of significant mistakes that allowed Juana Barraza, the true culprit, to continue her killing spree unchecked for years. One of the earliest and most costly missteps made by the police was their assumption that the killer was male. This belief stemmed from the nature of the crimes. The victims were often found strangled, subdued with a level of physical strength that the authorities assumed only a man could possess. The way in which the victims were overpowered and the wrestling style holds used to incapacitate them led police to conclude that the murderer had to be a man with a background in physical combat. This faulty assumption shaped the early stages of the investigation, leading authorities to focus their attention on male suspects. The descriptions provided by witnesses also contributed to the confusion. Several eyewitnesses had reported seeing a figure with broad shoulders, strong arms, and large hands fleeing the scenes of the crimes. These observations, combined with the police's preconceived notions about the killer's strength, steered the investigation in the wrong direction. In a particularly misguided move, the police turned their attention to Mexico's transgender community. Believing that the killer might be a transgender woman, they conducted sweeps and investigations within this community, wasting valuable time and resources. Transgender women were harassed, profiled, and unfairly targeted as part of the investigation, but no evidence linked any of them to the murders. As the investigation floundered, the real killer Juana Barraza was free to continue her deadly spree. Barraza's appearance contributed to the police's confusion. She was physically imposing, with a muscular build honed from years of professional wrestling. This, combined with her ability to easily overpower her victims, allowed her to fly under the radar while the authorities were looking in the wrong direction. The wasted focus on transgender suspects delayed the capture of Barraza for years. By the time the police realized their mistake and shifted their attention to the possibility of a female killer, dozens of elderly women had already lost their lives. It wasn't until 2006, when Barraza was caught fleeing the scene of her final murder, that the police finally apprehended the notorious old lady killer. But by then, the damage had been done, and Barraza's reign of terror had already scarred an entire generation of elderly women. This period of missteps in the investigation became a critical part of the narrative, highlighting not only the errors made by law enforcement, but also the vulnerability of marginalized communities who were wrongfully targeted. It would take years for the full extent of these mistakes to be acknowledged, but the failure to identify the true killer earlier remains a haunting aspect of the case. As Juana Barraza's crimes escalated, the police initially focused on male suspects due to the strength and methods used in the murders. However, key eyewitness reports would soon challenge that assumption and shift the direction of the investigation. Several witnesses had reported seeing someone fleeing the scenes of the murders, someone who didn't fit the profile of the male suspect the police had envisioned. These descriptions painted a picture of a woman who was physically strong, broad-shouldered, and muscular, which threw the police into further confusion. Some witnesses even described this person as wearing women's clothing with short hair and a stocky build. This description seemed odd to investigators at first, as it conflicted with the belief that only a man could carry out these brutal attacks. The turning point in the investigation came when these witness accounts consistently described a woman seen near the homes of the victims. At first, the police were reluctant to let go of their theory about a male killer, but the reports from multiple witnesses were difficult to ignore. The description of a strong, broad woman who seemed capable of overpowering her victims was unlike the profile of the typical female criminal. This slowly began to shift the focus of the investigation, pushing the authorities to consider that the killer might, in fact, be a woman. This new direction was confirmed when the physical description of the suspect aligned with someone the police had previously overlooked: Juana Barraza, a former lucha libre wrestler. Barraza's muscular build, strength, and ability to overpower her victims fit the witness descriptions perfectly. Moreover, her use of wrestling techniques to strangle her victims linked her directly to the murders. These eyewitness reports were a critical breakthrough, as they helped redirect the investigation toward Barraza and away from the misguided focus on men or transgender suspects. The realization that the old lady killer was actually a woman with the physical ability to carry out such violent crimes was a turning point in the case. It shattered traditional gender expectations and added a layer of complexity to the investigation. This shift in focus ultimately led the police to look more closely at Barraza, helping to bring her reign of terror to an end. During her years as La Mataviejitas, Juana Barraza led a complex personal life marked by financial struggles, the burden of single motherhood, and the psychological remnants of her traumatic past. Far from the typical image of a serial killer, Barraza appeared on the surface to be an ordinary woman juggling the pressures of raising children and making ends meet. By the time she began her killing spree in the late 1990s, Barraza's wrestling career as La Dama del Silencio was behind her. Although wrestling had provided her with an outlet for her rage and strength, it had never been a lucrative profession. Lucha Libre wrestlers in Mexico, particularly those in the lower circuits like Barraza, earned very little. When a severe injury forced her to retire from wrestling, she was left without a stable source of income. At this point, Barraza was raising several children as a single mother. The details about her relationships are sparse, but it's known that she had at least two children and struggled to support them. Financial hardship was a constant in her life, and after her wrestling career ended, she found herself trapped in a cycle of poverty. She took on various jobs to make ends meet, including working as a popcorn vendor at wrestling matches and doing domestic work. However, these jobs did little to lift her out of her dire financial situation. Her situation became more desperate as time went on, and it's believed that her financial instability played a significant role in her descent into crime. What began as petty theft and burglary eventually escalated into something far more sinister. Targeting elderly women, whom she often robbed after murdering, allowed her to gain some financial relief, albeit fleeting. This desperate need for money combined with her deep-seated psychological trauma created the perfect storm that led her down the path of serial murder. Despite the horror of her actions, those who knew Barraza described her as a devoted mother who was fiercely protective of her children. This duality, being both a caring mother and a brutal killer, makes Barraza's case particularly chilling. Even as she took lives, she continued to live a relatively normal existence at home, caring for her children and hiding her crimes from the outside world. This contrast between her personal life and her crimes makes Juana Barraza a deeply complex figure. She was a woman battling personal demons, financial ruin, and the weight of her traumatic past, all while outwardly fulfilling the role of a mother. Yet, behind closed doors, she carried out some of the most terrifying crimes Mexico had ever seen. On a January afternoon in 2006, Juana Barraza's long reign of terror finally came to an end. For years, she had eluded capture, while Mexico City's elderly population lived in fear of the killer who preyed on vulnerable women. But on this particular day, her carefully constructed disguise crumbled. Her final victim was Ana Maria de las Reyes Alfaro, an 82-year-old woman living in the Venustiano Carranza neighborhood of Mexico City. Like so many of her previous victims, Alfaro was elderly and lived alone. Barraza approached her using her usual ruse, posing as a social worker offering assistance to elderly residents. Alfaro, trusting the woman at her door, allowed Barraza into her home, unaware of the danger she had just invited inside. What happened next followed the same grim pattern. Barraza quickly overpowered the frail woman, using her strength and wrestling techniques to subdue her. She strangled Alfaro with a stethoscope she found in the house, leaving her lifeless body behind. But this time, Barraza's actions did not go unnoticed. A neighbor who was close with Alfaro became suspicious when he saw Barraza fleeing the scene. The neighbor, already on edge due to the wave of killings in the area, quickly rushed into Alfaro's home, only to find her dead. Realizing what had happened, the neighbor acted swiftly, alerting nearby police officers who were patrolling the area. Barraza had not yet managed to escape far, and within moments the police caught up to her and arrested her as she attempted to flee the neighborhood. It was a dramatic and unexpected end for Barraza, who had managed to evade capture for years. As police apprehended her, the truth about the old lady killer began to unravel. The strong, broad woman who had haunted the nightmares of Mexico City's elderly population was, in fact, a former wrestler who had used her physical prowess to commit some of the most heinous crimes in the country's recent history. Barraza's capture marked the end of a chilling chapter in Mexico City's history, but the shockwaves of her crimes would continue to ripple through the city long after she was behind bars. The neighbors' quick actions on that fateful day helped bring an end to a spree that had taken the lives of at least 16 confirmed victims, though many believe the true number could be even higher. Following her arrest in January 2006, Juana Barraza was taken in for interrogation by the police. At this point, she was well aware that the evidence against her was mounting, particularly her capture at the scene of Ana Maria de las Reyes Alfaro's murder. While the authorities suspected Barraza in many more cases, they needed her confession to build a more concrete case around her. In the interrogation room, Barraza surprised investigators by readily admitting to some of her crimes. She confessed to the murder of Alfaro as well as a few other elderly women. Her motive, she explained, was driven by deep-seated resentment and hatred towards her mother, who had abandoned her as a child and sold her to a man for a few beers. Barraza's confession pointed to an emotional connection between the murders and her own unresolved trauma. She viewed each elderly woman as a symbolic representation of her mother, a way to exact the revenge she had never been able to take in her youth. However, while Barraza was open about certain killings, she adamantly denied involvement in others. This left the police frustrated, as they had linked her to far more murders than she was willing to admit to. Her fingerprints had been found at multiple crime scenes, and the pattern of killings suggested she was responsible for at least 16 deaths, if not more. Yet, Barraza downplayed her role, insisting that she had only been involved in a select few murders. This selective confession presented a challenge for investigators. While Barraza admitted to some of the crimes, her denial of others left many questions unanswered. Was she attempting to minimize her responsibility, or had she truly disconnected from the full extent of her actions? Regardless, her admission of guilt in the Alfaro case was enough to convict her, but the full scope of her crimes would remain partially shrouded in mystery. In her confessions, Barraza never displayed remorse for the lives she had taken. Instead, she seemed driven by her personal vendetta, her need to release the anger she harbored towards her mother. For Barraza, these murders were acts of revenge, not random violence, which made her crimes all the more chilling. After Juana Barraza's arrest, forensic evidence played a crucial role in solidifying the case against her. While her confessions were limited, the hard evidence told a much more comprehensive story. Investigators found Barraza's fingerprints at several crime scenes, linking her directly to multiple murders beyond those she was willing to admit to during her interrogation. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when forensic teams meticulously re examined the homes of elderly women who had been murdered over the course of Barraza's spree. In a number of these cases, fingerprints collected from the crime scenes matched those of Barraza. This forensic link was vital because it connected her to murders for which there had previously been no suspects. Even though she confessed to only a few murders, the fingerprint evidence made it clear that Barraza was responsible for many more. The presence of her fingerprints in multiple homes was undeniable proof that Barraza had been there during the time of the murders, contradicting her claims of limited involvement. These fingerprints were often found on the very objects she used to strangle her victims, such as scarves, cords, or household items. This crucial piece of forensic evidence directly tied her to several crime scenes, strengthening the prosecution's case against her. In addition to the fingerprint evidence, investigators also noted the striking similarity in how each murder was carried out. The consistent use of strangulation, often involving the victim's own belongings, as well as the specific knots resembling wrestling holds, further linked Barraza to the killings. While forensic evidence was key in affirming her guilt, it also illustrated just how methodical she had been in carrying out her crimes. Despite her denials of involvement in many of the murders, the fingerprint evidence stood in stark contrast to her selective confession, helping law enforcement piece together the broader scope of Barraza's killing spree. This forensic trail played a decisive role in her eventual conviction for multiple murders, as it provided an irrefutable link to the crimes even in the absence of full confessions. Juana Barraza's trial, which began in 2008, was one of the most highly publicized criminal cases in Mexican history. By the time it reached the courtroom, Barraza had been linked to a series of brutal murders that had shaken Mexico City for nearly a decade. The prosecution alleged that she was responsible for as many as 48 murders, although the evidence conclusively tied her to 16 murders and 12 burglaries. Barraza's defense strategy focused on downplaying the extent of her involvement, sticking to her confessions of only a few murders. However, the weight of forensic evidence, particularly the fingerprints found at multiple crime scenes and the testimony of witnesses who had seen her fleeing several murder scenes, made it clear that Barraza had been at the center of a killing spree that left Mexico City's elderly women in terror. During the trial, the emotional weight of the proceedings was palpable. Barraza sat through testimonies from victims' families, hearing the accounts of the horrifying last moments of their loved ones. Despite the gravity of the situation, Barraza showed little remorse, maintaining her cold and emotionless demeanor throughout much of the trial. Her motive, rooted in a deep resentment toward her mother, became a central part of the prosecution's case. The killings, the prosecution argued, were not just about financial gain, but were driven by a complex psychological need to exact revenge on elderly women who represented her mother. On March 31st, 2008, the court handed down its verdict. Barraza was convicted of 16 murders and 12 counts of burglary. For these crimes, she was sentenced to an astonishing 759 years in prison. Under Mexican law, however, the maximum prison term that can be served is 60 years, meaning Barraza would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The sentencing brought some relief to the families of the victims, but it also left lingering questions. Many wondered if the full extent of Barraza's crimes would ever be known. Given her refusal to confess to the majority of the murders and the uncertainty surrounding the true number of victims, some feared that justice had only been partially served. Though she will never see freedom again, Barraza's case continues to be a source of fascination and horror in Mexico. Her conviction marked the end of one of the most notorious serial murder sprees in the country's history, but her story lives on in the media and public consciousness as a reminder of the deep scars she left behind. The number of victims attributed to Juana Barraza remains a point of uncertainty and speculation, even after her conviction. While she was officially found guilty of 16 murders, investigators and criminologists believe that the real number could be much higher. Some estimates suggest that Barraza may have been responsible for the deaths of up to 48 elderly women across Mexico City during her killing spree, which spanned nearly a decade. This discrepancy between the number of murders she was convicted for and the possible total is due to several factors. First, many of the murders Barraza was suspected of occurred before the police even realized they were dealing with a serial killer. Initially, these deaths were often written off as robberies gone wrong or natural causes due to the victim's advanced age. By the time authorities connected the dots, many potential crime scenes had been compromised or lacked the forensic evidence needed to definitively tie Barraza to the murders. Furthermore, while Barraza confessed to a handful of murders, she consistently denied involvement in the majority of the killings, even when strong evidence, such as fingerprints, suggested otherwise. Her reluctance to admit to all of the murders leaves investigators with the difficult task of determining how many of the unsolved cases can truly be linked to her. The consistency in the method of strangulation and the profile of the victims points to Barraza in many of these cases, but without her confession, some of those murders remain unresolved. It's important to note that in some of the cases where Barraza was suspected but not convicted, there was insufficient forensic evidence to formally charge her. The nature of the crimes targeting elderly women who lived alone made it easier for her to evade detection for years, and many of these unsolved cases might never be officially linked to her. Some experts believe the final number of her victims will likely remain unknown, though the pattern suggests she killed far more than the 16 for which she was convicted. This uncertainty continues to cast a shadow over her case, as the true scope of Barraza's terror may never be fully uncovered. The potential discrepancy between the number of victims highlights both the brutal efficiency with which she carried out her crimes and the challenges law enforcement faced in tracking down a killer who, for so long, operated in plain sight. The arrest and subsequent trial of Juana Barraza sent shockwaves through Mexico, particularly in Mexico City, where her crimes had taken place. For years, elderly women had been living in fear of the old lady killer, locking their doors and mistrusting even the most well meaning strangers. Her arrest in 26 provided some relief, but it also ignited widespread outrage. For many, the fact that Barraza had managed to evade capture for so long was a source of anger and frustration. The media's coverage of the case had heightened fear across the city, with every new murder feeding into a growing sense of panic. After her arrest, protests erupted, with many calling for greater protection for vulnerable citizens and for the police to improve their investigative tactics. The public's reaction was one of disbelief as well. The revelation that Barraza, a former professional wrestler and mother, was behind the killings shocked the nation. It wasn't just the brutality of her crimes that disturbed people. It was the fact that she had managed to live among them undetected for years. The psychological motivations behind Juana Barraza's crimes are deeply rooted in her traumatic past. From a young age, Barraza experienced betrayal and abuse at the hands of her mother, who sold her to an older man for 3 beers. This experience scarred her emotionally, leading to a deep-seated hatred for older women. Many experts believe Barraza's killing spree was her twisted form of revenge. Each elderly woman she murdered was, in her mind, a surrogate for the mother who had abandoned and betrayed her. Her resentment ran so deep that she systematically sought out vulnerable, elderly women, gaining their trust before brutally strangling them. While financial gain was a factor she often robbed her victims, there is no doubt that her actions were driven by unresolved psychological trauma. Barraza's murders were not just acts of violence, they were symbolic, deeply personal vendettas aimed at exercising her long held anger towards her mother. This makes her case stand out, as it wasn't driven solely by a need for power or control, but by the scars of her childhood that never healed. After her sentencing, Juana Barraza adjusted to life in Santa Marta Acatitla, a prison in Mexico City. Surprisingly, Barraza seemed to embrace her new environment. Despite the gravity of her crimes, she managed to build a life for herself behind bars. She took on work as a gym instructor, utilizing her strength and physical prowess skills honed during her wrestling career. Barraza also started selling tacos in prison, using the small income to support herself and maintain contact with her family. In an unexpected twist, Barraza even remarried while incarcerated, although the marriage didn't last long and ended in divorce. While she remains a highly controversial figure in Mexican criminal history, Barraza's behavior in prison has been relatively quiet. She continues to serve out her sentence, knowing that she will never leave prison. Juana Barraza's story has captivated audiences around the world, leading to multiple portrayals in the media. Early on, her case was depicted in Nujer Casos de la Vida Real, a popular Mexican TV series that dramatized real life crimes. Barraza's gruesome story reached an even wider audience when the show Mujer's Asesinas dedicated an episode to her, painting her as a tragic and dangerous figure. Perhaps the most in depth exploration of her life came with The Lady of Silence, a Netflix documentary that delved deep into the psychology behind her crimes and the broader societal impact. The documentary shed light on the systemic failures that allowed Barraza to go undetected for so long, and it also humanized her, exploring the trauma that shaped her life. The series prompted mixed reactions, with some viewers horrified by the details and others fascinated by the psychological depth of her story. The Mataviejitas case had a profound impact on Mexican law enforcement, particularly regarding how serial killer investigations were handled. The early police investigation was plagued by errors, including the assumption that the killer was male, which led the authorities to waste time targeting the wrong suspects. This misstep, especially the focus on Mexico's transgender community, sparked controversy and revealed deep flaws in the police's investigative methods. In the wake of Barraza's capture, law enforcement officials faced significant public criticism, forcing them to reassess how they handle serial murder cases. The failures of the investigation underscored the need for better forensic capabilities and more efficient coordination between police units. This case also raised awareness about the importance of protecting vulnerable populations, leading to reforms aimed at improving the safety and support systems for Mexico's elderly community. As Juana Barraza remains in prison, her legacy continues to haunt Mexico. Her crimes have left a permanent scar on the families of her victims, who must live with the knowledge that their loved ones were taken in such a brutal and senseless manner. Barraza's case also remains a chilling reminder of how unresolved trauma and systemic failures can collide to create a perfect storm of violence. Barraza's life in prison may be quiet, but the ripple effects of her actions are far from over. Mexico City, particularly its elderly population, still feels the lingering effects of fear even years after Barraza's capture. Her story remains a source of fascination for true crime enthusiasts and a cautionary tale for law enforcement officials tasked with preventing similar tragedies in the future. And that's the chilling story of Juana Barraza, the old lady killer. Her life is a twisted tale of trauma, violence, and revenge that will haunt Mexico's history for years to come. But there's more to this case than just the details of her crimes. It raises questions about how society handles trauma, protects its most vulnerable, and holds law enforcement accountable for mistakes. If you found this story as fascinating and disturbing as I did, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into true crime cases just like this one. Don't forget to like the video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on all my latest uploads. Let's keep this conversation going, and thank you for watching.